At 81 years old, Buck Albright had stopped expecting miracles. He'd buried his wife, his son, and every dream he'd ever held, leaving him alone in a world that had moved on. Then one scorching afternoon in the Mojave Desert, he found wild donkeys dying of thirst, a newborn foal barely breathing among them. Something in that tiny creature's eyes wouldn't let him walk away. With nothing but a rusty canteen, Buck carried the foal and began saving the herd. Word spread to the nearby town. People started showing up with water and hope. What Buck thought was one last good deed became something he never expected. Could saving forgotten creatures bring a forgotten man back to life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Buck Albright stepped out onto the sagging porch of his trailer, coffee mug in hand. The Mojave stretched before him like an old friend who'd run out of things to say, quiet, familiar, and asking nothing. He'd been living in this patch of desert 40 miles from anywhere for 3 years now, ever since he'd sold what was left of the ranch in Riverside County. The trailer wasn't much, but it was paid for, and at his age, that counted for something. Buck took a slow sip of his coffee, black and strong the way Helen used to make it. She'd been gone 9 years this October. Their boy, James, had followed her 6 years later. Cancer took them both, though Buck sometimes thought what really killed James was a broken heart. The kid had worshipped his mother. After she passed, he'd just sort of faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The morning air still held a trace of coolness, though by noon it would be over 100 degrees. Buck didn't mind the heat. He'd spent his whole life under the sun, first on his father's cattle ranch near Bakersfield, then running his own spread with Helen for 43 years. They'd raised Herefords mostly, good stock that fetched decent prices before the droughts came and stayed. Before everything changed. He set the mug down on the porch railing and reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a small object wrapped in a faded handkerchief. His fingers, gnarled and spotted with age, carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal a simple gold wedding band. Helen's ring. He'd carried it with him every day since the funeral, a habit he couldn't quite explain and didn't try to. Some mornings he'd take it out and just look at it, remembering the way her hand felt in his, the calluses they'd both earned from ranch work, the silent understanding that had grown between them over the decades. The ring caught the early light, gleaming softly. He turned it over in his palm, reading the inscription inside for the 1000th time, H and B, always. She'd insisted on that when they'd picked out the rings in 1961. Simple and true, she'd said. Just like us. Buck folded the ring back into the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket, right over his heart. Then he picked up his coffee and walked down the 3 wooden steps to the dirt yard. His truck, a '94 Ford that had seen better decades, sat in what passed for shade beneath a struggling mesquite tree. He'd need to drive into Ridgecrest today for supplies. The trip took an hour each way, but he only made it once a week, less if he could stretch things. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles south, a young couple, probably in their 50s, who'd bought an old mining claim and were trying to live off-grid. Buck had met them exactly once, when their Jeep broke down on the access road. He'd given them a tow back to their place, accepted their thanks, and driven home. They seemed nice enough, but Buck wasn't looking for company. That was the thing about the desert that suited him. It didn't expect conversation, didn't ask how he was feeling or tell. Him, it was time to move on. It just was. Day after day, unchanged and unchanging. The rocks, the scrub, the lizards sunning themselves on warm stone, they'd all been here before him and would be here after. There was a comfort in that kind of permanence, even if it was the permanence of emptiness. Buck finished his coffee and went back inside to make a list. Canned goods mostly. Beans, soup, vegetables, bread that would last, coffee of course. He'd learned to live simply, paring his needs down to the essentials. The trailer had electricity from a small solar setup James had installed during one of his last visits, and a propane tank for the stove. Water came from a well that still pumped clear and cold, one of the few blessings of this particular patch of nowhere. He remembered James standing in this very spot, adjusting the solar panel angle, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You don't have to live out here like this, Dad," he'd said, "not for the first time. You could come stay. With me in Sacramento, I've got room." Buck had shaken his head. "This suits me fine, son. You've got your own life to live." But James hadn't had much of a life, as it turned out. Never married. Worked as an accountant for the state, lived alone in a small apartment, and visited his father every few months. After the cancer diagnosis, Buck had driven up to help him through the treatments. He'd watched his boy waste away in a hospital bed, the same way he'd watched Helen, and something in him had just closed up tight after that, like a fist that wouldn't open. The list finished, Buck grabbed his keys and headed for the truck. The drive to Ridgecrest took him past country he'd known all his life. Ancient volcanic rock, Joshua trees standing like sentinels, dry lake beds that shimmered in the heat. He'd been born in this desert in 1944, raised on stories of cowboys and Indians, of hard men making hard livings in hard country. His father had been one of those men, tough as boot, leather, and about as talkative. Buck supposed he'd inherited both traits. The road was empty except for the occasional semi-hauling freight between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Buck kept the truck at a steady 55, in no particular hurry. The radio picked up nothing but static out here, so he drove in silence, watching the landscape roll past. It was a familiar meditation, this drive. The same rocks, the same turns, the same scattered evidence of human passage, old fence posts, rusted equipment, the occasional foundation where someone's dream had died. Ridgecrest wasn't much a small city that existed mainly to service the naval base at China Lake, but it had a grocery store and a hardware shop, which was all Buck needed. He parked on a side street and made his way into the supermarket, moving slowly through the aisles with his list. The fluorescent lights bothered his eyes after the desert brightness, and the air conditioning raised goosebumps on his arms. He recognized a few faces, other old-timers who'd been around forever, but nobody spoke beyond a nod. That was fine with Buck. He gathered his supplies methodically, checking prices out of habit, though he had enough money saved to last him out. James had left him everything. Not that there'd been much. The state pension, the sale of the apartment, a small life insurance policy. Combined with Buck's own Social Security, it was plenty for a man who needed almost nothing. At the checkout, a young woman with tired eyes rang up his groceries. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a baby in a carrier strapped to her chest. The child slept peacefully against her while she worked, and Buck felt a familiar ache in his chest. He'd held James like that once, brand new and impossibly small, Helen smiling up at him from the hospital bed. $63.18, the woman said, her voice flat with exhaustion. Buck paid in cash, counting out the bills carefully. As he gathered his bags, the woman said, "Thank you. Have a nice day." He nodded, the closest he came to a reply, and headed back to his truck. The drive home was the same in reverse, the sun now climbing higher, the heat building. By the time he pulled up to his trailer, sweat was running down his back despite the open windows. He unloaded the groceries, putting everything away in its proper place. Order mattered when you lived alone. It was too easy to let things slide, to stop caring about the small disciplines that held life together. Buck had seen it happen to other men his age, the slow dissolution into squalor and confusion. He was determined not to go that way. With the supplies stored, he made himself a simple lunch, a can of soup heated on the stove, some crackers, a glass of water. He ate, standing at the counter, looking out the small window above the sink. The view showed nothing but desert and sky, endless and indifferent. After lunch, he considered his options. The afternoon stretched ahead, empty as always. He could read. He had a stack of westerns he'd been working through. He could check the fence line around his property, though there was nothing to keep in or out. He could work on the truck, though it ran fine. Mostly he could just sit and wait for the day to end, the way he'd been doing for 3 years. Buck reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief again, unfolding it to look at Helen's ring. In the harsh afternoon light, the gold looked worn, the inscription barely visible. 43 years she'd worn this ring. 43 years of partnership, of shared work and shared silence, of a love that didn't need fancy words because it was built into every day. "What am I doing out here, Helen?" he asked the empty trailer. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough from disuse. The ring offered no answer. But then, it never did. Buck folded it back into the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket. Then he grabbed his hat and old Stetson that had weathered decades of sun, and headed outside. He'd walked the property line. At least that was something to do. The desert afternoon wrapped around him like a blanket as he set off, following the barely visible track that marked his boundary. His steps were slow but steady, and his shadow stretched long beside him. Somewhere overhead, a hawk circled on a thermal, and in the distance, heat waves made the horizon dance. Buck Albright walked his empty land under the burning sun, carrying his dead wife's ring over his heart, and tried not to think about how many more days like this he had left. 3 days after his supply run, Buck woke to a morning that felt different somehow. The air held a strange tension, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. He went through his usual routine coffee on the porch, a scan of the empty horizon, but found himself restless in a way he hadn't been in months. By mid-morning, he'd decided to take a longer walk than usual. There was an old mining road about 4 miles northeast that he hadn't explored in over a year. No particular reason to go that direction, but no reason not to either. He filled his canteen at the well, checked that his hat was secure, and set off. The canteen was an artifact from another lifetime. Buck had carried it during his brief stint in the army back in the 60s, never saw combat, just trained in the desert at Fort Irwin for 2 years before his discharge. The aluminum was dented and scratched, the canvas cover stained and frayed, but it still held watertight. He'd been meaning to replace it for probably 20 years, but it still worked, and Buck wasn't one to discard things that still had use. The walk took him through familiar terrain at first, the land around his trailer that he'd covered 100 times. But as he pushed further northeast, following the faint trace of the old mining road, the landscape shifted slightly. More rock outcroppings here, evidence of the volcanic activity that had shaped this country millions of years ago. The scattered remains of mining equipment, rusted ore cars, collapsed shaft houses, tangles of cable spoke to the brief boom that had brought men to this nowhere place a century back, searching for silver that mostly wasn't there. Buck paused to rest in the shade of a large boulder, taking a drink from the canteen. The water was already warm, but it cut the dust in his throat. He checked his watch, nearly 11. He should think about heading back soon. The temperature was climbing past comfortable. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind or his imagination. But there it was again, a thin, desperate braying that seemed to come from beyond the next rise. Buck stood, his knees complaining, and walked toward the sound. As he crested the low hill, the sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. In a shallow depression surrounded by rock, 5 donkeys lay scattered like dropped toys. They were wild burros, descendants of the animals miners and prospectors had released or lost over the years. The desert was full of them, though you didn't often see them this close to human habitation. These 5 looked to be in serious trouble. 2 were clearly dead, their bodies already stiffening in the heat. The other 3 were still alive, but barely. An adult Jenny lay on her side, breathing in shallow gasps, her ribs showing sharp beneath her hide. Near her, a younger animal, maybe 2 years old, had managed to lift its head, but looked unable to rise. And tucked against the Jenny's belly was the source of the crying, a foal that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Buck approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The Jenny's eye rolled toward him, showing white, but she didn't have the strength to move. The foal was making the sound he'd heard, a pitiful noise that cut right through Buck's carefully maintained defenses. He knelt beside them, his old knees protesting, and assessed the situation with the practical eye of a man who'd spent his life around livestock. They were dying of thirst and heat, plain as day. There was no water source visible anywhere nearby, and from the looks of their hoofprints in the dust, they'd been circling this spot for some time, probably too weak to travel further. The foal looked up at him, with eyes that seemed impossibly large and dark. There was something in that gaze, a desperate, trusting plea that went straight to a place Buck thought he'd locked away years ago. This tiny creature, new to the world and already facing death, had no idea what was happening. It only knew it was suffering, and here was something that might help. Buck unslung his canteen and unscrewed the cap. He poured a little water into his cupped palm and held it near the foal's muzzle. The small animal sniffed weakly, then its tongue came out, rough and desperate, lapping at the precious liquid. Buck gave it a little more, then moved to the Jenny. She was too far gone to lift her head, so he dribbled water directly onto her tongue. Her throat worked, swallowing reflexively. He looked at the canteen in his hand, maybe 3/4 full. Not nearly enough for 3 dying animals in the middle of the desert. Not nearly enough for the 4-mile walk back to his trailer in heat that was now pushing past 100 degrees. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to mark the location in his mind, walk back to his trailer, and maybe call animal control in Ridgecrest. Let someone whose job it was to deal with wild animals come out and handle it. That's what a reasonable person would do. Buck poured another handful of water for the foal. He'd already made his decision, really. He'd made it the moment those dark eyes looked up at him. He couldn't explain it, didn't try to, but he knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep, that he wasn't walking away from this. The Jenny, despite his small offering of water, wasn't going to make it. He could see that. Too far gone, too depleted. The younger donkey might have a chance if he could get water to it quickly enough. But the foal, this impossibly fragile new life, that was the one he had to save first. Buck shrugged out of his shirt, leaving just his undershirt. He spread the shirt on the ground and carefully lifted the foal onto it. The animal was lighter than he expected, all bones and oversized ears, but still a solid weight in his arms. He fashioned the shirt into a kind of sling, settling the foal against his chest and shoulder. It was too weak to struggle. With the foal secured, Buck gave the last of his canteen water to the younger donkey and the dying Jenny. It wouldn't save them, but it seemed important to try. Then he stood, feeling the full weight of his 81 years in every joint and muscle, and began the long walk back. The sun beat down like a hammer. His shadow had shrunk to almost nothing. Beneath him, the foal's breathing was rapid and shallow against his chest, and he could feel its heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Buck set a pace he thought he could maintain, slow and steady, like the old cattle drives his father used to talk about. Rush and you'll kill yourself. Go too slow and you won't make it. Find the rhythm and trust it. He marked his progress by landmarks. He knew the red outcropping shaped like a fist, the cluster of Joshua trees that looked like they were dancing. Each step was an act of will. The empty canteen banged against his hip, mocking him with every stride. His mouth felt full of cotton, his throat clicking when he swallowed. The foal made small sounds against him, and Buck found himself talking to it, his voice a dry rasp. "Stay with me now," he muttered. "Not much further. Just got to keep moving." He realized he was giving himself the same advice. When his trailer finally came into view, shimmering in the heat waves, Buck felt something close to relief. Close, but not quite. He still had work to do. He carried the foal up the porch steps and into the blessed shade of the trailer, laying it gently on the cool linoleum floor. Then he filled a bowl with water and brought it back. The foal drank desperately, too fast. Buck had to pull the bowl away, make it slow down. "Easy," he told it. "Easy now, you'll make yourself sick." He sat on the floor beside the foal, his back against the cabinet, and watched it drink in careful intervals. Outside, the desert baked under the afternoon sun. Inside, an old man and a dying animal shared water and silence. Buck reached into his pocket and pulled out the handkerchief, unfolding it to look at Helen's ring. What would she think of this? Of him carrying a half-dead donkey foal across 4 miles of desert instead of doing the sensible thing? He thought he knew. She'd have done the same thing. She'd have called him a fool, probably, but she'd have helped without question. That was who they'd been together, practical people who still believed that some things mattered more than practicality. The foal's breathing began to slow, to steady. Its eyes, no longer glazed with desperation, looked at Buck with what might have been trust. "Well," Buck said to the empty trailer, to the ring in his hand, to whatever was listening, "guess we're doing this." He had no idea what this was yet, but for the first time in 3 years, he had something that needed him, and that was enough to start. The foal survived the night, which was more than Buck had expected. He'd bedded it down in the trailer's small bathroom, the coolest room he had, with towels and an old blanket James had left behind. Every few hours through the night, he'd gotten up to check on it, offering water and watching its breathing. By dawn, the small animal was actually standing, wobbly but determined. Buck sat on the bathroom floor with his morning coffee, watching the foal explore its small space. It was a dusky grey colour with darker points on its legs and muzzle, and those impossibly large ears that seemed to swivel independently, tracking every sound. When it looked at him, Buck felt that same pull he'd experienced in the desert, a connection he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. "Need to call you something," he said. The foal's ears swiveled toward his voice. "Can't just keep saying, 'Hey, you.'" He thought about it while he finished his coffee. Finally, he settled on Dusty. Simple, appropriate, and it didn't carry any weight of memory, just a name for a donkey that had nearly died in the dust. With Dusty stable for the moment, Buck's thoughts turned to the other 2 animals, the young one and the Jenny. He hadn't been able to save them yesterday, but that didn't mean they were beyond help. If they'd survived the night, and that was a big if they'd need water, lots of it. He spent the morning preparing. He filled every container he owned, gallon jugs, old milk bottles, his 2 spare canteens. He loaded them into the bed of his truck, along with some grain he'd bought months ago on a whim, thinking he might attract birds to watch. The truck's water tank was still half full from his last fill-up, enough to make it back to town if needed. Before leaving, he checked on Dusty one more time. The foal had curled up on the blanket and appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Buck left the bathroom door cracked and a bowl of water within reach. The drive to where he'd found the herd took longer than walking had, the old mining road barely passable, even in 4-wheel drive. Rocks scraped the truck's undercarriage, and more than once Buck had to get out and move larger obstacles. But eventually he made it to the depression where the donkeys had been. The Jenny was dead. Buck had known she would be, but seeing her stiff form in the morning light still hit him harder than he wanted to admit. The younger donkey, though it had moved, he found it about 50 yards away, in the shade of a rock overhang, still breathing. Buck parked and unloaded his water. He approached slowly, talking in a low, steady voice. "Easy now. I'm here to help. Just take it easy." The donkey's eyes showed white, and its muscles tensed to flee, but it was too weak. When Buck poured water into a shallow pan he'd brought, the animal's thirst overcame its fear. It drank frantically while Buck stroked its neck, feeling the prominent vertebrae, the dehydration-loose skin. He named this one Ash, for the grey-brown color of its coat. Over the next hour, he got Ash to drink nearly 2 gallons of water, offered grain that was mostly ignored, and did his best to assess the animal's condition. Malnourished, definitely. Dehydrated, clearly. But young and maybe strong enough to recover with time and care. Getting Ash to the truck was going to be a problem, though. The donkey couldn't walk far, and while it wasn't full-grown, it still weighed several 100 pounds. Too much for an 81-year-old man to carry. Buck sat down on a rock to think, his hat pushed back, sweat already soaking his shirt. This was the point where a younger man, or a man with any sense, would call for help. There were animal rescue organizations, probably, people whose job it was to handle situations exactly like this. But Buck's phone, an old flip model he kept, charged more out of habit than necessity, showed no signal out here. and even if it did, he wasn't sure he wanted to make that call. This felt personal somehow, like something he needed to do himself. He looked at Ash, who had laid down again in the shade, eyes half closed, looked at the dead Jenny nearby, thought about Dusty back at the trailer, alive because Buck had been too stubborn to do the sensible thing. While he sat there thinking, his hand went to his pocket out of habit. He pulled out the handkerchief, but this time something else came with it, a photograph that must have been tucked in the divan, same pocket. Forgotten. It fluttered to the ground, and Buck picked it up. The photo was old, the colors faded to soft pastels. It showed Helen standing beside their horse trailer, getting ready for a county fair. She was probably in her 50s then, grey already threading through her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes. Behind her, Buck could see James, maybe 20 years old, leading one of their Herefords. And there, at the edge of the frame, was Buck himself, younger, straighter, wearing the same Stetson he wore now. He stared at the photograph for a long time. They'd been a team then. Helen managing the books in the house, James helping with the heavy work when he wasn't away at college, Buck running the day-to-day operations. They'd had purpose. They'd had each other. They'd been part of something larger than themselves. When had he stopped being part of things? When had he decided that being alone was better than risking more loss? Buck folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket with the ring. Then he stood up, his decision made. He couldn't carry Ash, but he could make this place livable until the donkey was strong enough to walk to the truck. And while he was at it, he could check the area for any other members of the herd who might need help. He spent the rest of the day setting up what amounted to a field camp. He strung a tarp between rocks for better shade. He established a watering station with the containers he'd brought. He scattered grain in several locations, hoping to tempt Ash's appetite, and he searched the surrounding area, walking in widening circles from the depression. He found one more burro, an older male, standing in the meager shade of a creosote bush about a quarter-mile south. This one was in better shape than the others had been, clearly more experienced at desert survival, but still showed signs of the same desperation, prominent ribs, dull coat, cautious movements. Buck managed to coax it toward water with grain, and the animal drank deeply before retreating to a safe distance. Buck decided to call this one Flint, for the hard look in its eyes and the way it evaluated everything with obvious suspicion. Flint watched Buck's every move with the wariness of something that had learned not to trust easily. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Buck had done everything he could. 3 donkeys, one back at his trailer, recovering, one here gaining strength, one watching from a distance, deciding whether to trust. He drove back to his trailer as the desert cooled, his muscles aching, his skin burned despite his hat and long sleeves. Dusty greeted him with enthusiastic braying when he walked in, clearly hungry and possibly lonely. Buck mixed some grain with water to make a mash and watched the foal eat with determined focus. "Got yourself some family," Buck told Dusty, whether they know it yet or not. He made himself a simple dinner soup again, crackers, water, and sat on his porch as the stars emerged. The night was vast and clear, the Milky Way visible as a river of light overhead. Somewhere out there, Ash and Flint were bedding down for the night, probably wondering what had happened to their peaceful, if harsh, existence. Buck reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph again, looking at it in the starlight. Helen, James, himself, a family, a team, a reason to get up in the morning. Maybe, he thought, it was time to be part of something again. Even if that something was just an old man and some dying donkeys in the middle of nowhere. Buck fell into a routine over the next several days that was more demanding than anything he'd done in years. Each morning before dawn, he'd check on Dusty, feed and water the foal, then load his truck with supplies and make the rough drive out to the mining road. He'd spend hours with Ash and Flint, slowly building trust, ensuring they had water and food, checking their condition. Then back to the trailer by early afternoon to escape the worst heat, tend to Dusty again, and rest before the evening feeding. It was exhausting work for a man his age. His back ached constantly. His hands, never steady anymore, trembled with fatigue by nightfall. But it was also the first time in 3 years he'd gone to bed feeling like the day had mattered. On the 4th morning of this routine, as he was preparing to head out, he remembered something. He went to the storage compartment under the trailer, where he kept things he couldn't quite throw away, and started digging through boxes that hadn't been opened in years. He found it near the back, a leather satchel, cracked with age and covered in dust. Buck pulled it out and carried it into the trailer, setting it on his small table. The brass latches were stiff but still worked. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were the tools of veterinary care he'd accumulated over 43 years of ranching. The kit wasn't professional grade. Buck had never been a vet, just a rancher who'd learned to handle most problems himself because calling someone out to remote Riverside County cost more than most treatments were worth. But Helen had helped him build a solid collection over the years. Syringes, needles, various bottles of antibiotics and vaccines, hoof tools, bandages, a stethoscope that had been her gift to him one Christmas. He lifted the stethoscope out carefully. The rubber tubing had gone brittle in places, but it was still functional. Helen had presented it to him with a smile, saying, "Now you can pretend you know what you're doing." Most of the medications were long expired, useless now. But the tools themselves, those were still good. The hoof pick, the files, the scissors. He could use these. He should use these, especially on Ash, whose hooves he'd noticed were overgrown and cracked. Buck packed the still useful items back into the satchel, added them to his supplies for the day, and headed out. Dusty watched him leave with what Buck was starting to recognize as the foal's version of indignation. The little creature didn't like being left alone. "I'll be back," Buck told it. "Always come back." At the mining road camp, he found Ash standing, a good sign. The young donkey had been lying down more than standing when Buck first started coming. Now it greeted him with a tentative approach, clearly associating Buck with food and water. Flint remained at a distance, still wary, but Buck noticed the older male was staying closer to camp now, within 50 yards instead of a quarter-mile away. Buck set out the morning water and grain, then approached Ash with the veterinary kit. "Need to look at your feet," he told the donkey. "Not going to hurt you, but you might not like it much." It took patience, more patience than Buck remembered having, back when he'd worked cattle on deadlines and budgets. But he had nothing but time now, and Ash had nowhere else to be. Slowly, with quiet words and gentle touches, Buck worked his way around to lifting each of the donkey's hooves in turn. They were in rough shape, as he'd suspected. Overgrown, cracked in several places, packed with debris. Wild burros usually kept their hooves worn down naturally through constant travel over rocky ground, but Ash's malnourished condition meant it probably hadn't been moving much before Buck found the herd. Buck worked carefully, using the pick to clean out packed dirt and stones, the file to smooth rough edges. It was slow, careful work that made his back scream and his knees threaten to give out. But it was also familiar, almost meditative. His hands remembered this work, even if his body protested. When he finished, Ash's hooves weren't perfect, that would take time and proper growth, but they were better. The donkey stood more comfortably, shifting its weight with what looked like relief. "There," Buck said, straightening up slowly. "That's something. Anyway." He was packing the tools away when he heard an engine. Buck looked up, surprised. Nobody came out this way. The mining road was barely passable and led nowhere anyone wanted to go. A truck appeared over the rise. Newer than Buck's, a Dodge painted desert tan. It pulled up about 20 yards away and stopped. A woman got out, maybe 60, sun-weathered face, practical clothes. She studied Buck for a moment before speaking. "You're the one who's been coming out here," she said. "Not a question." Buck nodded slowly. "Didn't know anyone was watching. My husband and I live about 6 miles south. We saw your truck going past on our trail camera, got curious." She gestured toward the tarp shelter, the water stations, Ash standing nearby. "This you're doing?" "Found them dying," Buck said simply. "Seemed worth trying to help." The woman walked closer, looking at Ash with an experienced eye. "Wild burros. We get them around our place too. Most people don't bother with them. She turned back to Buck. You know what you're doing? Used to run cattle. Same principles mostly. She smiled at that. I suppose so. She extended her hand. I'm Sarah Martinez. My husband Tom and I have been out here about 5 years, trying the off-grid life. Buck shook her hand. Buck Albright. Well, Buck Albright, what you're doing here is good work. These animals have had a hard time of it. Drought's been rough on all the wildlife. She paused. You need any help? The question surprised him. Buck had gotten so used to doing everything alone that the idea of accepting assistance felt foreign. But looking at Sarah's open, honest expression and thinking about the work still ahead, he found himself saying, "Wouldn't turn it down." Sarah nodded. "Tom and I have some extra hay we could spare, and I've got veterinary experience, used to work with large animals before we retired. If you want a second opinion on their condition, I'm happy to take a look." Before Buck could respond, Flint chose that moment to venture closer, curious about the newcomer. The older burro approached to within 10 yards, watching Sarah with cautious interest. "Well, look at you," Sarah said softly. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" Flint's ears swiveled, processing this new voice. Sarah glanced at Buck. "How many are there?" "3 that I found. This one here," he gestured to Ash. "Another older male there," a nod toward Flint, "and a foal I've got back at my place, maybe a week old when I found it. 2 others were already dead." Sarah's expression grew somber. "The foal survived. So far, that's something." She looked around the makeshift camp. "You're out here every day?" "Morning and evening." "That's a lot for anyone. How far's your place?" "About 8 miles. Trailer off County Road 39. Sarah pulled out her phone, checked something, then put it away. "Tom and I could spell you sometimes, if you'd like. We're closer, and we've got the time." Buck started to refuse automatic response, 3 years of habit. But he stopped himself. Why refuse? Pride. The need to do everything alone because that's what he'd been doing. That seemed suddenly foolish. "Appreciate that," he said instead. They spent the next hour going over the animals' conditions together. Sarah confirmed Buck's assessments, offered some suggestions about diet and care, and promised to bring hay the next day. When she finally left, Buck felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the lightness that comes from shared burden. That evening, back at the trailer with Dusty, Buck sat at his small table with the veterinary kit open in front of him. He ran his fingers over the tools, remembering Helen's hands, helping him treat a difficult birth, James learning to hold a calf still while Buck administered shots, the countless small medical crises they'd handled together. He'd thought those days were behind him forever, that he'd never again be part of something that required this kind of care and attention. But here he was, with 3 wild burros depending on him, and neighbors he'd never expected offering help. Buck closed the kit carefully and set it by the door, ready for tomorrow. Outside, the desert night was cool and star-filled. Inside, a foal slept peacefully in the bathroom. And somewhere out at the mining road, 2 more burros were resting in the shelter he'd built. It wasn't the ranch. It wasn't Helen and James. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. True to her word, Sarah showed up the next afternoon with her husband Tom and a truck bed full of hay. Tom was older than his wife, probably pushing 70, with the kind of lean build that came from physical work rather than gyms. He shook Buck's hand with a firm grip and got straight to helping unload. Between the 3 of them, they had the hay stacked under the tarp shelter within an hour. Ash seemed more interested in the activity than afraid, watching the humans work from a safe distance. Flint had retreated to his usual observation post, but Buck noticed the older burro hadn't gone as far as usual. "You've made good progress with them," Tom observed, offering Ash some hay by hand. The young donkey sniffed it carefully before taking a bite. "Week ago, this one probably wouldn't have let you within 50 yards. "Hunger helps," Buck said. Sarah laughed. "So does patience, which not everyone has." As they worked, Tom mentioned that word had gotten around about Buck's rescue effort. "Sarah told a few folks in town when we went in for supplies. There's some interest. Don't be surprised if more people want to help. Buck wasn't sure how he felt about that. He'd started this as a private thing, just him and the burros. But he supposed once you involved other people, even good people like Sarah and Tom, word was going to spread. That was the nature of small communities. Long as they don't spook the animals, he said finally. Tom nodded. Understanding. I'll make sure folks know to keep their distance unless you okay it. That evening, Buck brought Dusty outside for the first time since the rescue. The foal had grown noticeably stronger over the past week, and the bathroom was starting to feel cramped. Buck fashioned a small pen using some old fencing he'd found in his storage, creating a shaded area where Dusty could move around without wandering off into the desert. The foal took to the expanded space with obvious joy, kicking its back legs and racing in small circles. Buck sat on his porch steps and watched, feeling something warm expand in his chest. When was the last time he'd felt this? Not happiness exactly, but something close, satisfaction maybe, or purpose. His knees were bothering him more than usual after all the kneeling and lifting of the past week. As he sat there, he reached down and pulled out something he'd tucked behind the door that morning, a walking stick he'd carved years ago but rarely used. Helen had always teased him about his stubbornness regarding canes or walkers, saying he'd probably refuse them until he fell and broke something important. The walking stick was made from a thick piece of juniper, the wood polished smooth by years of handling. Buck had carved it during a slow winter when the ranch work was light, more to keep his hands busy than out of any need. The handle was shaped to fit his palm, and along the shaft he'd carved a simple pattern of leaves and vines, nothing fancy, just something to look at. He'd made it the winter after James moved to Sacramento for his job. The house had felt too quiet with just Helen and him, and he'd needed something to occupy the long evenings. Helen had watched him work on it, offering occasional comments, her knitting needles clicking in the background. Now, testing his weight on it, Buck found it helped considerably. The stick took some pressure off his knees and gave him better balance on the uneven desert ground. Pride was all well and good, but there was no point being stubborn when a simple tool could make the work easier. Over the next few days, more people did start showing up. Most were respectful, keeping their distance as Tom had requested. They brought donations, hay, buckets, a better tarp, some feed specifically formulated for equines. One woman, introduced by Sarah as Linda Chen, was a retired nurse who'd grown up on a ranch. She offered to help check the animal's health and create a feeding schedule. Buck found himself at the center of something he'd never intended, a small community of concerned people rallying around 3 wild burros. It was overwhelming at times, all these faces and names when he'd grown used to solitude, but it was also, he had to admit, not entirely unwelcome. One afternoon, a man about Buck's age drove out in a well-maintained RV. He introduced himself as Ray Porter, said he'd heard about the rescue from his granddaughter, who worked at the grocery store in Ridgecrest. Used to raise horses, Ray explained, leaning on Buck's truck and looking at the setup they'd built. Been retired about 10 years now. Wife passed 2 years back. Been wandering around the desert in that RV ever since, trying to figure out what to do with myself. Buck understood that, without needing more explanation. It's hard, he said simply. It is. Ray watched Ash for a moment. Mind if I ask you something? Buck nodded. What made you do this? Most folks would have just called animal control. Let someone else handle it. Buck thought about that, leaning on his walking stick. It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself. Couldn't walk away, he said finally. Saw that foal looking at me and I just couldn't. Ray smiled. Sometimes that's all it takes. One moment where you can't turn away. He straightened up. I've got some experience with hooves, if you need help, and I've got nothing but time. By the end of the second week, Buck had a small team of regular volunteers. Sarah and Tom came every other day. Linda stopped by twice a week to check on the animal's health. Ray showed up most mornings to help with feeding and hoof care. A younger couple, the Johnsons, brought their 2 teenage kids on weekends to help clean and maintain the camp. Ash had gained weight and energy, enough that Buck was considering moving the young burro to his trailer property where there was more space. Flint had started accepting food from Buck's hand, though the older donkey still maintained a cautious distance from most other people. And Dusty was thriving, growing at what Linda assured Buck was a healthy rate. One evening, as Buck was finishing the last feeding of the day, Ray joined him. They worked in comfortable silence for a while before Ray spoke. "Town's starting to talk about making this more permanent," he said. "Some folks are asking about getting the land designated as a sanctuary for wild burros that need help." Buck paused, his hand on the walking stick. "That so?" Linda's been researching the legal stuff. Apparently there are grants available, and the BLM has programs for wild horse and burro protection. Could set up something real out here. Ray glanced at Buck. Would need someone to run it, though. Someone who knows what they're doing. The implication hung in the air. Buck looked around at what had grown from his simple act of carrying a dying foal across the desert. The shelters, the water stations, the feeding areas, the people who came regularly to help. The three animals who were alive, because he'd been too stubborn to walk away. "I'm 81 years old," Buck said. "So? I'm 78. Doesn't mean we're done being useful." Buck tested his weight on the walking stick, feeling the smooth wood under his palm, remembering the winter he'd carved it. Making something just to keep his hands busy, never imagining he'd actually need it, never imagining a lot of things. "Let me think on it," he said. Ray nodded. "Fair enough, but think about this too. You've already brought together more people than this desert's seen in years. And they're not here for the view. They're here because you showed them something worth caring about." That night, Buck sat on his porch with the walking stick across his knees. Dusty was asleep in the pen, secure and healthy. Tomorrow he'd go check on Ash and Flint. Help would be there, Ray probably, maybe Sarah and Tom. People he hadn't known 2 weeks ago who were now part of his daily life. He pulled out the photograph of Helen and James, looked at it in the starlight. A family, a team, a purpose. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe being done wasn't a choice you made at a certain age. Maybe it was something you decided every day, every time you chose whether to walk away or stay. The idea of a sanctuary kept working on Buck like a splinter under the skin. He found himself thinking about it at odd moments, while feeding Dusty, while driving out to check on the others, while lying awake in the pre-dawn darkness listening to the desert wind. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as impractical. He was too old, too set in his ways, too comfortable with solitude. Running a sanctuary would mean more people, more responsibility, more chances for things to go wrong. It would mean committing to something long-term when he'd spent 3 years trying not to commit to anything beyond the next meal. But another part of him, a part he'd thought had died, with James whispered that maybe this was exactly what he needed. A reason to get up that went beyond mere habit. A legacy that didn't end when he did. 3 weeks after finding the burros, Buck was going through boxes in his storage again, looking for some old tools he thought might be useful. Instead, he found a leather journal he'd forgotten about, wedged between a stack of ranch records and some of Helen's old recipe books. The journal had been a gift from James. About 15 years back, presented at Christmas with an embarrassed shrug. "Thought you might want to write down some of your stories," James had said. "You know, about the ranch, about Grandpa, things like that." Buck had thanked him, set it aside, and promptly forgotten about it. He wasn't much for writing, and his stories seemed too ordinary to be worth recording. Who wanted to read about fixing fence lines and treating cattle for scours? But apparently he had written something, because when he opened the journal now, he found the first dozen pages filled with his own cramped handwriting. The entries were dated from that same Christmas through the following spring. They weren't daily logs or detailed narratives, just scattered observations and memories, the kind of things you wrote when you couldn't sleep and needed to put thoughts somewhere beside your own head. Buck sat down on an overturned bucket and started reading. The entries were mundane, mostly. Notes about weather, cattle prices, repairs needed around the ranch. But scattered throughout were other things, memories of his father teaching him to rope, Helen's laugh when a calf they'd raised won reserve champion at the fair, James calling from Sacramento to share some small triumph at work. One entry, dated late February, caught his attention. James came by today. Looks tired. Says work is fine, but I don't believe him. He's too thin, too quiet. Invited him to stay for dinner, but he said he needed to get back. Watched him drive away, and wondered when I stopped knowing how to talk to my own son. Helen would have known what to say. She always did. I miss her most in these moments, when I can see something's wrong but don't have the words to fix it. Buck closed the journal, his throat tight. 6 months after that entry, James had been diagnosed. 6 months after the diagnosis, he was gone. And Buck had spent the 3 years since trying not to think about all the conversations they'd never had, all the things left unsaid. He sat there for a long time, the journal in his hands, before finally opening it again and flipping to the first blank page. He found a pen in his pocket, the cheap kind they gave away at the feed store, and started writing. April 27th. Found 3 wild burros dying in the desert 3 weeks back. Brought them home. Started trying to help. Didn't plan for it to become anything bigger. Now there are people involved. Good people. They want to make it a sanctuary. Not sure what to think about that. He paused, then continued. Helen would have liked this. She always said I was at my best when I had something to care for besides myself. Maybe she was right. These past 3 years I've just been waiting, I think. Waiting for it to be over. Waiting to join her and James. But these burros, they don't care about my waiting. They need water and food and attention. They need me to show up. And maybe I need that too. Over the next several days, Buck found himself returning to the journal in the evenings. He wrote about the progress with the burros, about the people who'd come to help, about his own confusion over what was happening. The writing wasn't elegant or profound, but it helped him think through things that seemed too tangled to sort out in his head alone. Ray brought news that Linda had found a potential grant through the Bureau of Land Management's Wild Horse and Burro program. The application was complex, requiring detailed plans and documentation, but it could provide funding for infrastructure, veterinary care, and even a small stipend for caretakers. She needs someone to sign as the primary applicant, Ray explained. Someone who owns the land or has long-term rights to it, and someone who'll commit to managing the place. Buck nodded slowly. His trailer sat on 5 acres he owned outright, paid for with money from the ranch sale. And the mining road area where he'd found the burros was on BLM land that could potentially be leased for conservation purposes. How long would the commitment be? Buck asked. Minimum 5 years for the grant terms. But realistically, once you start something like this, it becomes ongoing. Animals keep needing care. Word spreads. More burros show up needing help. Ray looked at Buck directly. It's not a small thing I'm asking you to consider. That night, Buck wrote in the journal, Ray asked me to commit to 5 years. I'm 81. 5 years means I'd be 86. Hell, 5 months isn't guaranteed at my age. But when did I start measuring my life in what I might not have instead of what I do? I have today. I have these 3 burros that are alive because I didn't walk away. Maybe that's enough to build on. The next morning, he woke early and drove out to the mining road. Dawn was just breaking, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold. Ash came to greet him immediately, the young burro now confident and healthy enough to approach without hesitation. Flint watched from his usual spot, but Buck noticed the older male had moved his resting place closer to the camp, progress in its own way. Buck spent an hour doing the morning routine: water, feed, checking hooves and general condition. As he worked, he thought about the journal entry from 15 years ago, about wishing he'd known what to say to James, about all those unsaid things. He couldn't change the past. Couldn't bring back Helen or James or undo the 3 years he'd spent in isolated grief, but he could choose what happened next. He could choose to show up. He could choose to be part of something again. When Sarah arrived mid-morning to help, Buck was ready. "Tell Linda I'll sign the application," he said. "I'll do it. The sanctuary." Sarah's face broke into a wide smile. "You're sure?" Buck looked at Ash, at Flint, thought about Dusty back at the trailer. 3 animals who existed in this moment because he'd made a choice to carry a dying foal across 4 miles of desert instead of walking away. "I'm sure," he said. That evening he made a new entry in the journal. "Started a thing today that I probably won't live to see finished. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to see the ending. Maybe it's just to make sure there is one." He thought about adding more, something profound or meaningful. But in the end, he just closed the journal and set it on the table where he could see it. A reminder that even old men had stories still to write, and that sometimes the next chapter started with a simple choice, to stay instead of walking away. Outside, the desert stretched vast and eternal under a ceiling of stars. Inside, Buck Albright sat at his small table and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like he might actually have a future worth planning for. The grant application process took nearly 2 weeks to complete. Linda and Ray helped Buck navigate the bureaucratic maze of forms, requirements, and supporting documentation. They took photographs of the burrows, documented their health improvements, created detailed maps of the proposed sanctuary boundaries. Buck signed where they told him to sign, answered questions about his ranching background, and tried not to think too hard about what he was committing to. The application was submitted on a Tuesday morning. That same afternoon, Buck had an unexpected visitor. He was working in Dusty's pen, reinforcing one of the fence posts, when he heard a vehicle approach. A sedan this time, not a truck, unusual for this area. The car pulled up near his trailer, and a man got out, younger than Buck by maybe 20 years, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that marked him as someone from town rather than desert folk. "Buck Albright?" the man called. Buck straightened, his walking stick within reach. "That's right." The man approached, hand extended. "I'm David Chen, San Bernardino County Animal Control. I understand you've been caring for some wild burros." Buck shook his hand warily. "Word travels fast. Small community. People talk, especially when it's good news." David smiled. But Buck noticed the man's eyes were doing an assessment of the property. The pen, the trailer, Dusty watching from the shade. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" They sat on Buck's porch, and David pulled out a tablet. The questions started simple. How many animals? Where he found them? What kind of care he was providing? Buck answered honestly, watching the man's face for any sign of trouble. "The thing is, Mr. Albright," David said after about 10 minutes, "wild burros fall under federal protection through the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971. Technically, you need authorization from the BLM to capture or hold them, even for rescue purposes." Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. Didn't know that. Most people don't. And in cases of emergency rescue, there's usually some flexibility. David looked up from his tablet. "But I've been asked to verify the situation, make sure everything's being handled properly. Would you mind showing me the animals?" They drove out to the mining road in Buck's truck, David following in his sedan. At the camp, Ash and Flint were both visible, Ash in the shade of the tarp, Flint keeping his distance as usual. David spent nearly an hour examining the setup, taking photos, asking questions about diet and veterinary care. "You've done good work here," David said finally. "These animals are clearly better off than when you found them. But I have to be straight with you, Mr. Albright. There's been a complaint, anonymous. Someone claims you're keeping wild animals in inadequate conditions, possibly for profit or exploitation." David raised a hand before Buck could respond. "I can see that's not the case. But I have to follow up on complaints. It's my job." Buck felt anger rising, a hot flush in his chest. "I haven't made a penny off these animals. Hell, I've spent my own money keeping them alive." "I believe you, and my report will reflect that." David paused. "But here's the situation. Until you have official authorization from the BLM to hold these animals, You're technically in violation of federal law. Now, I can give you some time to get that authorization, especially since you've already applied for the sanctuary grant. But if another complaint comes in, or if someone higher up the chain decides to make an issue of it, things could get complicated. What kind of complicated? They could require the animals be transferred to a federal holding facility, or to an approved sanctuary in another location. David met Buck's eyes. I don't think that's going to happen, but I need you to understand it's a possibility. After David left, Buck sat in his truck for a long time, staring at nothing. Who would have filed a complaint, and why? He'd been careful not to make a nuisance of himself, hadn't asked anyone for help they didn't volunteer. The burros weren't bothering anyone out here in the middle of nowhere. He drove back to his trailer feeling older than his 81 years, the walking stick resting against his leg like a reminder of his limitations. Dusty greeted him with enthusiastic braying, unaware that their time together might be limited by forces Buck didn't understand. That evening, sitting at his table with the journal open, Buck found himself reaching for something he kept in a small wooden box on a shelf. His hand closed around it a silver deputy's badge, tarnished with age. He'd been a reserve deputy for San Bernardino County for almost 20 years, starting back when he was in his 40s and the ranch was doing well. It was volunteer work mostly, helping with search and rescue in the desert, providing backup during busy times. He'd carried that badge with pride, feeling like he was part of something larger than himself, serving his community. Helen had worried about it sometimes, but she'd also been proud. My cowboy lawman, she'd called him. James had thought it was interesting, asked questions about the work. Buck had loved having stories to tell his son, adventures that didn't involve cattle prices and feed costs. He'd turned in his badge after Helen died, couldn't muster the energy to care about anyone else's emergencies when his own life was falling apart. But he'd kept this one, a spare from when his regular badge needed repair. It had never been officially returned, just sat in his drawer for 9 years, collecting dust. Buck turned it over in his hands now, feeling the weight of it. He'd worn this badge because he believed in something, in helping people, in making things a little better, in being part of a solution instead of just another problem. When had he stopped believing that about himself? The next morning, Sarah stopped by with news. She looked troubled, which was unusual for her normally upbeat demeanor. Buck, I think I know who filed that. Complaint, she said without preamble. There's a developer from Las Vegas who's been trying to buy up land in this area, wants to build some kind of luxury desert resort. He's been pressuring Tom and me to sell, and we've said no. What's that got to do with the burros? He probably sees your sanctuary as an obstacle. If the BLM designates this area for burro conservation, it makes development a lot harder. He's trying to shut you down before you even get started. Buck felt the anger return, sharper this time. Can he do that? He can try. He's got money and lawyers. But you've got something too: community support. People care about what you're doing here. After Sarah left, Buck sat on his porch and thought about the developer, about David Chen's warning, about the possibility of losing the burros he'd worked so hard to save. He thought about the badge in his hand and what it had represented, a commitment to stand up for what was right, even when it was easier to walk away. He'd walked away once, after Helen and James died. He'd turned in his badge, sold his ranch, and retreated to this trailer in the middle of nowhere. He'd spent 3 years being invisible, asking nothing of anyone and offering nothing in return. But the burros had changed that. Or maybe they'd just reminded him of who he used to be before grief had hollowed him out. Buck stood up, testing his weight on the walking stick. His knees protested, his back ached, and he was definitely too old for whatever fight was coming. But he'd been a rancher and a reserve deputy. He'd raised cattle and a son, been married to a woman who'd taught him that showing up mattered more than anything else. He went inside and pulled out his phone, scrolling through the contacts until he found the number he wanted, a former colleague from his deputy days who now worked as a BLM liaison. Jack, it's Buck Albright. Been a long time. Listen, I need some advice about wild burro protection laws. As he talked, explaining the situation, Buck felt something he'd thought was long dead stirring back to life. It wasn't quite hope, he was too old and practical for that. But it was determination, the bone-deep stubbornness that had gotten him through droughts and market crashes and every other challenge ranching had thrown at him. Someone wanted to take away these burros, to shut down the sanctuary before it even started. They probably figured an old man living alone in a trailer wouldn't put up much of a fight. They figured wrong. Buck finished his call with Jack, made notes about what he needed to do next, and then opened his journal. He wrote, "Found out today that someone's trying to stop the sanctuary. Probably some developer who sees wild burros as an inconvenience to his profit margin. David Chen from Animal Control came out, warned me about legal complications. Could lose the animals if I'm not careful. But here's what I keep thinking about. I wore a badge once because I believed in protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. These burros can't file appeals or hire lawyers. They can't fight developers or navigate bureaucracy. All they can do is trust that someone will show up for them. I showed up once, when I found that foal dying in the desert. I'm going to keep showing up, no matter who wants me to stop. Helen would expect no less. James would expect no less. And maybe, after 3 years of hiding from everything, it's time I expect more of myself too." He closed the journal and looked at the deputy's badge sitting on the table beside it. 2 artifacts from a life he'd thought was over, but maybe that life wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning again in a way he'd never expected. Outside, Dusty was waiting for evening feeding. Tomorrow, he'd check on Ash and Flint, continue the work regardless of what challenges lay ahead, and somehow he'd find a way to protect what he'd started here. Because that's what the badge had meant all those years ago, and that's what it still meant now. You showed up, you stood your ground, you protected what mattered. Even if you had to do it at 81, with a walking stick and a heart full of old grief, even then. Jack's advice was both helpful and daunting. Buck needed to document everything: photographs, veterinary records, receipts for supplies, statements from volunteers. He needed to file emergency rescue paperwork with the BLM, which should have been done within days of finding the burros, but could be backfilled with the right justification. And he needed to demonstrate community support for the sanctuary proposal, preferably in writing. The developer can file all the complaints he wants, Jack had said. But if you've got your documentation in order and local support behind you, the BLM will likely side with conservation over development, especially for wild burros. There's a lot of public sentiment around protecting them. Buck spent the next 3 days gathering what he needed. Linda helped him organize veterinary records and create a timeline of care. Ray took photographs that showed the dramatic improvement in all 3 animals. Sarah started a petition in Ridgecrest, gathering signatures from people who supported the sanctuary. The response surprised Buck. By the end of the first day, Sarah had over 200 signatures. People he'd never met were signing, leaving comments about the importance of protecting wildlife, about how they'd heard Buck's story and wanted to help. The grocery clerk, who'd checked him out for years, added a note saying she was glad to see him doing something good. Even the young mother with the baby in the carrier wrote, "This gives me hope." Tom brought news that the developer, a man named Richard Cord, had been asking around town about Buck, trying to find anything that might discredit him. "Apparently, he's not happy that his complaint didn't work," Tom reported. "He's looking for other angles." "Let him look," Buck said, though he felt a flutter of worry. His life had been simple for years, but before that, before the grief and isolation, he'd been just a rancher trying to get by. Nothing scandalous, nothing worth hiding, but everyone had things they weren't proud of. Decisions they'd made, mistakes they'd regretted. That evening, Buck was going through more old boxes, looking for ranch records that might support his experience with livestock, when he found another artifact from his past, a brass compass in a worn leather case. He opened it carefully, the brass still shining despite its age. His father had given him this compass on his 18th birthday, along with a simple speech Buck could still remember word for word. "A man needs to know which direction he's headed, Buck. But more important, he needs to know how to find his way home. Buck had carried this compass through his army service, through years of ranching, through the desert searches he'd done as a reserve deputy. It had guided him through country where landmarks all looked the same, where getting lost meant serious danger. Helen had teased him about it, said anyone could just use GPS now, but Buck had kept carrying it anyway. The compass had been in a drawer for 3 years, unused and unneeded. Where was there to go when you didn't particularly care about getting anywhere? But now, holding it, Buck thought about his father's words, about knowing which direction you're headed and finding your way home. He'd been lost for 3 years, not in the desert, but in his own grief. And somehow, a dying foal had become his compass, pointing him back towards something that felt like home, not a place, but a purpose. The next morning brought another visitor, this one more welcome. A woman in her 40s, professional but warm, introduced herself as Margaret Orozco from the Bureau of Land Management. "I'm here about your sanctuary application," she said, "and about the emergency rescue paperwork you filed. Mind if we talk?" They sat on Buck's porch with coffee. Margaret had brought her own travel mug, which Buck appreciated, and went through everything. She asked detailed questions about the rescue, about his plans for the sanctuary, about his background with livestock. She took notes, asked to see the burros, spent time observing their condition and the facilities Buck had built. Finally, she sat back and looked at Buck directly. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Albright. Your application for the sanctuary is strong. Your emergency rescue documentation is adequate, even though it's late. And frankly, the improvements you've made to these animals' health is impressive for someone working alone." "I haven't been alone," Buck said. "There are people who've helped." "I know. I saw the petition with over 300 signatures. That's significant community support." She paused. "But you should know that Richard Cord has also filed paperwork with the BLM. He's proposing a different use for this land, a luxury desert resort that he claims will bring jobs and revenue to the area. And he's arguing that allowing a burro sanctuary will set a precedent that limits economic development throughout the region." Buck felt his jaw tighten. "What happens now?" "There'll be a hearing in 2 weeks. Both proposals will be presented to the regional BLM board. They'll make a decision based on environmental impact, community benefit, and legal considerations. You'll have a chance to present your case." "I'm not much of a public speaker," Margaret smiled. "You don't have to be. Just tell them what you told me. Why you started this. What it means to the community. Let the animals and the work speak for themselves." After she left, Buck sat on his porch for a long time, the compass resting in his palm. A hearing. 2 weeks, his sanctuary proposal against a developer's resort plan. It seemed like a mismatch, an old rancher with some donated hay versus a man with money and lawyers. But as he sat there, his phone started ringing. Sarah, calling to say she'd heard about the hearing and was already organizing people to attend. Then Linda, offering to prepare a presentation about the health benefits of the sanctuary. Ray, suggesting they bring the burros to the hearing if possible, let people see what they were voting to protect. By evening, Buck had a dozen similar calls. People he'd barely known a month ago, rallying around him and the burros, with an energy that left him slightly overwhelmed and deeply moved. He opened his journal that night and wrote, "There's going to be a hearing. My sanctuary proposal against Cord's resort, 2 weeks to prepare. Part of me wonders what I'm doing, an old man fighting a developer with deep pockets over 3 wild donkeys most people wouldn't give a second thought to. But then I think about that foal looking at me in the desert. About Ash, learning to trust again. About Flint, still cautious but staying close. About all the people who've shown up to help, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Dad gave me this compass when I turned 18. Said a man needs to know his direction and how to find home. I've been directionless for 3 years, but maybe this is what finding home looks like, not a place, but a purpose. Not isolation, but community. Not waiting to die, but fighting to live." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Buck had never been busier in his life. not even during the ranch's peak years. Linda created a comprehensive presentation documenting the burro's health improvement, complete with before and after photos that told a powerful story. Ray organized a schedule showing how many volunteers were committed to helping with the sanctuary. Sarah worked with the local newspaper, which ran a feature story about Buck and his rescue effort. Tom surprised everyone by revealing he'd been filming the whole process, just on my phone, he explained, showing Buck footage of Dusty taking its first steps outside, of Ash approaching Buck for the first time without fear, of Flint gradually moving closer to the camp. Thought it might be worth documenting. The video was rough but powerful. It showed the transformation not just of the burros, but of Buck himself, from the solitary figure in early footage to someone surrounded by helpers and purpose. People Buck had never met started showing up at the mining road camp, wanting to see the burros, offering support. A teacher brought her class on a field trip, turning it into a lesson about wildlife conservation. A local radio station did an interview with Buck, asking him about his background and what motivated him to start the rescue. Buck found himself talking about Helen and James for the first time in years, not to a therapist or in grief group, but naturally as part of explaining who he was and why this mattered. He talked about the ranch they'd built together, about learning from his father, about believing that some things were worth protecting even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. The interviewer asked if he was nervous about the hearing. Nervous, Buck considered the question. I suppose, but I've been through worse. Lost my wife and son, lost the ranch. Spent 3 years thinking I was done with everything that mattered. Then I found these burros and realized I wasn't done at all. So whatever happens at that hearing, at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I showed up. 3 days before the hearing, Margaret Orozco called with news. Cord has filed another complaint, she said. Claims you don't have proper facilities for the animals, that you're too old to reliably manage a sanctuary, that your health poses a risk to long-term operation. Buck felt anger flash through him. My health is fine. I know, and we can address these concerns at the hearing. But I wanted you to be prepared. He's going to attack your credibility. Try to paint you as a well-meaning but impractical old man who doesn't understand what he's gotten himself into. After the call, Buck stood in his yard, looking at Dusty's pen, at the trailer where he'd lived alone for 3 years, at the desert, stretching endlessly in all directions. Was Cord right? Was he being impractical? He was 81 years old, with knees that ached and hands that shook. He lived in a trailer and drove a truck that was older than some of his volunteers. But he also had 3 healthy burros that had been dying when he found them. He had a community of people willing to fight for this sanctuary. He had experience and determination and a compass that had never failed to point him home. Buck pulled out the brass compass, opened it, and watched the needles settle toward north. His father had been right. A man needed to know his direction, and Buck's direction was clear. He was heading into that hearing, and he was fighting for what he'd built. Not because it was easy or because he was guaranteed to win, but because some things were worth protecting, and because he'd learned, over 81 years of living, that showing up was what mattered most of all. The hearing was held in a community center in Ridgecrest, a low building that usually hosted bingo nights and county extension classes. When Buck arrived, an hour early as was his habit, he was stunned to see the parking lot already filling up. Sarah waved from near the entrance, where she stood with Tom and at least 20 other people. Brought some support, she said with a smile. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the BLM board members, rows of chairs for attendees, and presentation equipment. Buck took a seat in the front row, his walking stick resting against his leg, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in his chest. He'd brought something with him, tucked in a canvas bag, an old saddle blanket from the ranch, weathered and faded, but still sturdy. Helen had woven it herself, back in the early days of their marriage when they couldn't afford to buy everything they needed. It was Navajo style, geometric patterns in red and black and cream, and Buck had used it on his favorite horse for 20 years. He didn't know exactly why he'd brought it. Maybe as a reminder of where he came from, Maybe as a connection to Helen, to feel like she was here with him. Maybe just because holding something worn and familiar made the modern meeting room feel less foreign. People continued to arrive. Buck recognized most of them from the past month: volunteers, people who'd signed Sarah's petition, the teacher who'd brought her class. There were also strangers, probably curiosity seekers who'd read the newspaper article. And near the back, looking supremely confident in an expensive suit, sat Richard Cord with two men Buck assumed were his lawyers. Margaret Orozco arrived with two other BLM officials, and began setting up at the front table. She caught Buck's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. At exactly 9 o'clock, the hearing began. Margaret introduced herself and her colleagues, explained the purpose of the meeting, and outlined the two proposals under consideration: Buck's sanctuary and Cord's resort development. "We'll hear from Mr. Cord first," Margaret said, "then from Mr. Albright. After that, we'll open the floor for public comment before the board deliberates." Cord stood and moved to the front with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was younger than Buck expected, maybe 50, with silver-touched hair and the kind of tan that came from tennis courts rather than outdoor work. His presentation was slick and professional. He showed architectural renderings of a beautiful desert resort, luxury casitas, a spa, an 18-hole golf course, a restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. He talked about job creation, increased tax revenue, economic development for a struggling region. "Ridgecrest and the surrounding communities have been in decline for years," Cord said, his voice smooth and practiced. "This resort represents an investment of over $50 million. It will create 200 permanent jobs and inject vital revenue into the local economy. Tourism dollars that currently go to Palm Springs or Las Vegas will stay here, benefiting local businesses." He paused, letting that sink in, then shifted his tone to something more regretful. "I respect Mr. Albright's compassion for these wild animals. I truly do. But we have to ask ourselves about priorities. Do we want emotional decision-making based on 3 donkeys, or do we want practical economic development that will benefit thousands of people? This region needs jobs and growth, not another underfunded conservation project run by—" he glanced at Buck, "someone without the resources or institutional support to maintain it long-term." Buck felt his jaw tighten, but he remained seated, his hands gripping the saddle blanket. Cord finished with more renderings, more statistics about economic impact, more promises about environmental sensitivity and water conservation. When he sat down, there was polite applause from a few people in the back, probably employees or associates he'd brought along. Margaret looked at Buck. "Mr. Albright, you're welcome to present now." Buck stood, his knees protesting, and walked to the front of the room with his walking stick in one hand and the saddle blanket in the other. He had no slides, no professional presentation, no architectural renderings, just himself and his story. He spread the saddle blanket across the presentation table, running his hand over the worn wool. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Cord's had been, but it carried in the silent room. "My wife made this blanket 62 years ago," he began. "We couldn't afford to buy one, so she learned how. Used it for 20 years on a horse named Red. When Red died, I kept the blanket. When my wife died, I kept it still. Not because it's valuable, you can see it's worn out in places, but because it reminds me of something important." He looked up, meeting eyes throughout the room. "It reminds me that the most important things we build don't always make economic sense. They make human sense. My wife didn't need to spend months weaving this blanket. Would have been more efficient to work extra hours and buy one. But she wanted to make something with her hands, something that would last. And it has." Buck paused, his hand still on the blanket. 3 weeks ago, I found 3 wild burros dying in the desert. Mr. Cord is right that saving them doesn't make economic sense. Would have been more efficient to let them die, let the desert take care of it. But I couldn't walk away. Sarah stood from the audience, holding something folded in her arms. She walked to the front and placed It on the table beside the saddle blanket, a quilt, hand-stitched, made from dozens of squares of different fabrics. "This was made by my mother," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Each square came from clothes we wore as kids, from my dad's work shirts, from curtains in our first house. She made it to remember all of us, to hold our family together in fabric when distance pulled us apart." She turned to address the room. "Buck taught me something these past weeks. He taught me that showing up matters, that caring for something beyond yourself matters. This quilt and his blanket, they're about the same thing. About making something that lasts not because it's profitable, but because it's right." Tom stood next. Then Ray, then Linda. One by one, people came forward with their own artifacts, their own stories. A rancher brought a branding iron that had been in his family for 4 generations. The teacher brought a book her grandmother had used to teach her to read. The young mother, with the baby carrier, came forward with a small knitted blanket. "My grandmother made this for my daughter," she said quietly. "It's not fancy, you can see the mistakes in the stitching, but it was made with love, and that's what makes it matter." Each person tied their artifact to Buck's story, to the sanctuary, to the idea that some things were worth protecting, not because they made economic sense, but because they represented something deeper: continuity, care, the belief that small acts of preservation mattered in a world that too often valued only profit and efficiency. By the time they finished, the presentation table was covered with artifacts, blankets, tools, books, photographs, items worn and faded but treasured nonetheless. Richard Cord's architectural renderings lay beneath them, literally buried under the weight of community history and shared values. Margaret called for public comment. Over 30 people spoke, most in support of the sanctuary. A few raised concerns about lost economic opportunity. But even they seemed moved by the testimony they'd heard. Finally, Cord stood to make a closing statement. He looked less confident now, his polished presentation undercut by the raw emotion of the past hour. "I appreciate the sentiment here," he said. "I really do. But sentiment doesn't pay bills or create jobs. When your children leave this area because there's no work, when your businesses close because there are no customers, you'll remember this day. You'll remember that you chose 3 donkeys over economic opportunity." He sat down to silence. Margaret looked at Buck. "Mr. Albright, do you have anything to add?" Buck stood again, leaning on his walking stick. He thought about everything he wanted to say, all the arguments he could make. But in the end, he kept it simple. "Mr. Cord talks about my children leaving for opportunity. My son did leave, took a job in Sacramento because there wasn't enough here for him. He came back when he could, but it wasn't often enough. He died 3 years ago, and I've got a lot of regrets about time we didn't spend together." Buck's voice roughened with emotion, but he continued. "These past weeks, working with these burros, I've met more of my neighbors than I did in 3 years of living alone. I've seen people come together not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I've watched kids learn about wildlife conservation. I've seen retired folks find purpose again. That's economic value too, even if it doesn't show up on a spreadsheet." He gestured to the artifacts on the table. "Every one of these items tells a story about people choosing to make something that mattered over something that was merely efficient. My wife could have bought a blanket, Sarah's mother could have bought a quilt, but they made them instead. And those acts of making, of caring, of choosing quality over convenience, that's what builds communities. That's what makes places worth staying in." Buck met Cord's eyes directly. "You can build your resort somewhere else. There's plenty of desert. But there's only one place where 3 burros are learning to trust again, where an old man found a reason to get up in the morning, and where a community came together to protect something that needed protecting. You can't relocate that, you can't reproduce it, and you sure can't measure its value in tax revenue." He sat down. The room was absolutely quiet. Margaret and her fellow board members huddled together, conferring in low voices. The audience waited, the tension thick enough to touch. Buck found himself gripping the saddle blanket, his fingers tracing the patterns Helen had woven so long ago. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, Margaret stood. "The board has reached a decision," she said. Based on the evidence presented, the documented community support, and the environmental considerations, we are approving Mr. Albright's application for wild burro sanctuary status. The land use permit for resort development is denied. The room erupted. People were standing, applauding, some crying. Sarah hugged Buck, nearly knocking him over. Ray was grinning from ear to ear. Tom thumped Buck on the back with enough force to make him cough. Through the celebration, Buck saw Richard Cord gathering his materials, his expression tight with controlled anger. Their eyes met across the room. Cord gave him a small, sharp nod acknowledgement. Maybe, or a promise that this wasn't over. But for now, Buck had won. The sanctuary was real. The burros were protected. And an old man who'd thought his story was finished had just started a new chapter. 6 months later, Buck stood at the entrance to the sanctuary, watching as Tom and Ray hung a new sign on the gate. The wood was fresh-cut cedar, the letters burned deep and clear. Desert Hope Burro Sanctuary, founded by Buck Albright. Should have your wife's name on there too, Sarah said, standing beside him. And James's. They're part of this story. Buck thought about that, then shook his head. They had their own stories. This one's different. But I carry them with me in it, if that makes sense. It does. The sanctuary had grown beyond anything Buck had imagined that first day, carrying Dusty across the desert. The BLM grant had come through, providing funding for permanent shelters, water infrastructure, and veterinary care. More burros had arrived, some rescued from the highway where they'd wandered into traffic, others found by hikers in distressed conditions. There were 11 now, each with a name and a story. Dusty had grown into a confident young burro, no longer the fragile foal Buck had saved. Ash had filled out beautifully, the young donkey's coat now glossy with health. Even Flint, who'd been the most cautious, had learned to approach Buck without fear, though he still maintained his independence. The sanctuary ran on volunteers, coordinated by a rotating schedule that Sarah managed. Ray handled maintenance and repairs. Linda continued to oversee veterinary care, now with the help of a local vet who donated his time. The Johnson kids came every weekend, and they'd brought friends. A small core of regulars had formed people like Buck, who'd found purpose in caring for animals that needed them. Buck's trailer now had a small addition, a office supply room that volunteers had built. Inside, the leather journal sat on a desk alongside veterinary records, volunteer schedules, and grant reports. The deputy's badge was pinned to a corkboard next to photographs of all 11 burros. The brass compass sat on the windowsill, catching the morning light. And the saddle blanket hung on the wall, a reminder of everything that had led to this moment. The hearing had been covered by news outlets across Southern California. The story of an 81-year-old man fighting a developer to protect wild burros had resonated with people far beyond Ridgecrest. Donations had poured in money, supplies, offers of help. The sanctuary had become something larger than Buck, sustained by a community that had rallied around the idea that some things mattered more than profit. Richard Cord had eventually built his resort, but 60 miles north in a different location. Buck had heard it was doing well, bringing jobs and tourism just as Cord had promised. Maybe everyone had won, in their own way. Buck walked through the sanctuary with his walking stick, checking on each animal. The afternoon was warm but not oppressive, a perfect desert spring day. Dusty trotted over immediately, nuzzling Buck's pocket for treats. Buck obliged with an apple slice, running his hand down the young burro's neck. "You started all this," he told Dusty. "You know that?" The burro just munched contentedly, unbothered by its historical significance. That evening, Buck sat on his porch, expanded now to accommodate the chairs volunteers had, donated, and pulled out Helen's ring. He'd started a new habit over the past months. Instead of just holding it in silence, he talked to her. Told her about the day, about the burros, about the people who'd become part of his life. "We got the sign up today," he said. "Sarah wanted your name on it, and James's." I said no, but I've been thinking about it. Maybe she's right. Maybe this whole thing started not when I found Dusty, but when you taught me that showing up mattered. When we built that ranch together. When James was born and we learned what it meant to care for something beyond ourselves. He paused, turning the ring over in his palm. I miss you, both of you, every day. But I think I'm okay now. Not happy the way I was with you, but okay. I've got work to do. People depending on me. Animals that need care. That's enough. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. From the sanctuary, Buck could hear the burros settling in for the night soft. Sounds of contentment that had become the soundtrack of his days. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the grief that had nearly swallowed him, the 3 years of isolation, the choice to carry a dying foal instead of walking away, the community that had formed around that single act of compassion, the fight to protect what he'd built. And now this, a sanctuary that would outlive him, sustained by people who'd learned the same lesson he had, that showing up mattered more than anything else. Buck opened his journal and made a final entry. The sign is up, the sanctuary is real. 11 burros call this place home now, and more will come. I won't see the end of this story. I'm 82, and realistic about my time, but I'll see enough. I'll see these animals thrive. I'll see people discover that caring for something beyond themselves gives life meaning. I'll see the desert stay wild and beautiful instead of becoming another parking lot. Helen used to say that, we don't get to choose what happens to us, but we choose how we respond. I chose grief and isolation for 3 years. Then I chose to pick up a dying foal. That second choice led to everything else, the community, the purpose, the sanctuary. It led me back to life. Tomorrow I'll get up and feed the burros, check water levels, work with volunteers, do the small daily work that keeps things running. It's not glamorous, it won't make me rich or famous, but it matters. And that's all I needed to be. He closed the journal and set it aside. The stars were emerging, brilliant against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the sanctuary, Dusty brayed a sound of contentment and security. Buck smiled. He'd found his way home after all. Not to a place, but to a purpose. Not through grand gestures, but through the simple choice to show up day after day and care for things that needed caring for. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.